Now, something I've had to get used to, especially in my cinematography and video production career, is being able to expose for skin tones. Now, in my career particularly, I've been working with a lot of people that are magnificently melanated. And in today's video, we're going to learn in 2025, how do we expose for darker skin tones? I have made this video before, but I wanted to give a little bit of more updated information, especially with some new things that I've learned. We're going to go over some of the tools that you can use to help get you better exposure, some of the techniques that you can use, and as well as how to use your lighting, your ND, and some of your camera settings to make sure that you can expose for skin tones that are, well, magnificently melanated. We'll get there. Now, as far as disclaimers go, this video isn't sponsored by anybody. It might be sponsored by myself and my LUTs, and you could go and check those out. But one thing that I want to point out is that I'm only going to give you my experience. I'm not an expert of anything. I have been working in video production and filmmaking over the last 6 years, and the majority of the people that I work with also have the same skin tone as me. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't necessarily have the answer to anything, but if you do want to drag your knuckles to the comments and leave something ridiculous, go ahead, tell the black dude how to expose for darker skin tones. Now, one thing that might be important to know is, what is the IRE scale? The IRE scale is a point system from 0 all the way up to 100 and even a little bit over 100 in order to attribute a certain luminance value that comes out of your camera's sensor. Essentially, what it's going to be is a 1 to 100 point scale of how bright a pixel is or how dark a pixel is. Obviously, if you're going to be at 0, it's going to be the darkest or absolutely black, and if you go somewhere 100 or above 100, well, it's going to be too bright to be able to recover. Now, you might be asking, how exactly do we observe the IRE scale? And there's two different ways that you can do it. One of the tools is going to be false color. If you ever see those weird color maps that you might see on somebody's camera or on their monitor, that's going to be something called false color. Essentially, what it's going to do is tell you the IRE scale of everything inside of your frame, and that way you're going to be able to expose for particular things. Another thing that you can use as well is going to be zebra. The reason why zebras might be in handy is because a lot of cameras don't have built-in false color to them. Right now I'm using the Blackmagic Pixis that does have false color, but that's one of the few cameras that have those built in. However, you can use a monitor in order to make sure that you can see some of the IRE values across your frame. So for those of you guys that don't know what zebras look like, this is going to be the same on every single camera, just where your menus are going to be, where it has zebras are going to be a bit different. So right now on my A7C II, I have it on my function menu, and I have my zebras over here, and I could turn them on. Now, I've already set mine to, spoiler alert, something a little bit less than 70 IRE, but what you can do is, if I could turn right over here, I can change this zebra value, and depending on where I am, it'll find particular IRE values instead of giving me an entire color map of each one. So as I move up on the zebra scale here, you're going to see different zebra lines show up, and that way you could actually pinpoint some of the IRE values, which is going to be important for exposing for skin tones. Also, because there isn't false color internally on a lot of cameras, this is going to be one of the tools that you can use in order to figure things out. Now, in terms of our settings here, we can use a bunch of different things. If we're going to expose for skin tones, one thing I recommend is using your ND and your lighting first. Your ISO might want to be fixed on there, especially if you're using a camera with native ISO or dual native ISO, and your aperture might be great to keep in the same place unless you're okay with the differences in depth of field. For this video, I'm going to use my ND filter. I have a Peter McKinnon filter on my Blaze R Remus lens, and I'm going to use my Nanlite Forza 300 for the most part in this video to expose for different skin tones. Now, when I started in cinematography and video production, one of the things I was told for skin tones was to expose at 70 IRE. Now, this might be sound advice, but I think it only adhere to one particular tone of skin. If I try to expose a darker skin tone for 70 IRE, you're going to run into a couple of problems. Okay, so this is why trying to expose for 70 IRE doesn't make any sense. So right now, if we have our false color onto here, where the skin tone is going to lie is a little bit on that more paler side. It's past the pink, it's past that gray, it's past middle gray at 18%. And when we turn off our false color, you'll notice that things look overexposed or even a little bit blown out. Now, even if I go back into my raw tab on DaVinci Resolve, what will happen is the skin tones are going to look a little bit plasticky. This is something that we don't want, and this is where getting that this is where the advice to expose as close to 70 IRE as you can doesn't make a ton of sense. If you try to overexpose something that was already on the darker side to begin with, one thing you're going to notice in your false color is that it's going to get closer to the red, which typically in false color means you're going to have things that are so blown out you can't bring those things back. Now, in order to bring the skin tone up to closer to 70%, or at least much higher than it was past one stop past middle gray, you're going to notice that right on both sides of the screen, information is entirely blown out and it's way too bright. Now, if I'm not using any light, you would have to do that, but this is what that's going to look like if I want to bring things up to 70%. Now, this is going to go to more anecdotal notes. This is something that I do when I'm trying to expose for darker skin tones. Now, in the Sony version of this video that I made a couple of years ago, I talked about where some of the skin tones lie, particularly in terms of your log profile. Now, for some other cameras, maybe using a Lumix camera like the S9 that I have right now, or a Blackmagic camera, there isn't actually a line on any of their websites where skin tones are going to lie. But if I extrapolate a little bit here, Sony manufactures a lot of people's sensors, which means that some of the values might be around the same. For example, right now I'm actually exposing my skin tones at around 45 to 50 IRE. Now, depending on which camera, which log profile you're going to use, your middle gray is going to be somewhere around 40 or 41, or even just a little bit below that. So essentially what I'm trying to say is I expose a little bit above the middle gray in order to get my darker skin tones intact. Now, what's nice about this is that if I expose my skin tones properly, not only can I protect my highlights, for example, my windows, but at the same time, it's not so far from middle gray that you're going to get some unnatural looking skin tones. Okay, so it's time for Uncle Kofi to tell you the Ghanaian language of the day. So last video, we talked about your day name if you were a boy. But for the ladies that will watch this channel, I want to talk about what your name would be if you were a girl. So if you're born on a Monday, you'd be Ajwa, Ajwa. If you're born on Tuesday, you'll be Abina, Abina. On Wednesday, you'll be Akuya, Akuya. On Thursday, you'll be Ya. Not Yao, but you'll be Ya. On Friday, you'll be Afia, Afia. On Saturday, you'll be Ama, Ama. And on Sunday, you'll be Akuswa, Akuswa. Okay, back to the video. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. Now, the skin tones on this side, it's a little bit green. It's in that darker type of gray over here, and that's going to be closer to around that 45 to 50 IRE. Now, as you can tell, also, the windows aren't completely blown out. It would be red in that situation. However, once we kind of sit things back here, once we kind of place things into here, the skin tone looks a lot more natural and makes a lot more sense. The exposure, when we put our light down, we actually took it down by 2 stops. This looks like it makes a lot more sense than trying to expose the skin tones for 70 IRE. This is some of the basics you can use when you're trying to get some exposure for darker skin. It works on other skin tones as well, but your IRE is going to change a little bit based on who the person is. Now, there are other techniques that you can use to make your life a little bit easier and to make your footage look that much better. For one is actually using lower ISOs. Now, again, on that Sony video, I talked mostly about Cine EI and exposing for a lower Cine EI in order to get more details in your shadows. Now, shadow and darker details are things below middle gray at normal exposure, essentially are probably going to be your darker skin tones, where using a lower ISO is going to be more beneficial. If I show you a dynamic range chart from pretty much any of the modern cameras, as you're in the lower ISO ranges, you might notice that objectively there's going to be more information on the lower end versus the higher end. Now, what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean to go to your lowest ISO, don't use lighting and just let things be pitch black and try to bring things up from there, because it's going to introduce a lot of noise. But what it does mean that if you are operating at a lower gain or a lower ISO, when your lighting is dialed in, you're going to have cleaner shadows and also some cleaner darker areas, particularly, well, melanated skin. Now, I am going to do a comparison between 200 ISO and 3200 ISO on the Blackmagic Pixis, and even when I equate the exposures, you're going to notice that there is quite a lot more noise on the 3200, even if they're at the same exposure. The reason why is because the higher in the ISO you go, you might get a little bit more in the highlights, but you are giving up some of that shadow information, which means that things like darker hair or darker skin tones or any of the darker feature on somebody's skin might not be properly exposed at 3200, which might sound a little bit counterintuitive to what you're told, but essentially using a higher ISO in every situation, especially when things are darker, doesn't make the most amount of sense. Low light doesn't mean no light, so you want to make sure that even at lower ISOs, you're still lighting properly. Now, another thing, and I've been talking about this in quite a few videos, is actually using a circular polarizer. Now, when we're talking about that harsher highlight that you might have coming from the side where your key light is, using a circular polarizer helps get rid of some unwanted glare and flare, which helps actually bring back some of those skin tones that might be affected in the highlights from a light. I'm just going to put a side-by-side example over here, but I have done this quite a few times. And this is super helpful, especially when you need to have a bright key light on a person's face, and at the same time, you don't want that kind of artificial, sourcey type of light coming from there. Now, this also might not be technically sound, but I do cheat my white balance a little bit higher than what the light is. So for example, right now I'm using the Nanlite Forza 300. Now, this is a 53 to 5500 Kelvin light, and typically when I use it on darker skin tones, it does appear to be a little bit blue if I'm matching up the white balance to the light itself. So I might go up a little bit higher. I might go a couple of Kelvin, maybe 200, 300, and sometimes as high as 1000 in order to bring out some of the colors that you might find in darker skin tones. Generally speaking, if you use a light that's a little bit too cool, skin tones tend to look purple on darker skinned people, and absolutely nobody likes that. Now, a lot of this information you could have found in a previous video, but there's a couple of things that were asked in the previous video that I want to bring up here now. For example, what exactly happens when you have 2 different types of skin tones that you need to expose for in a single frame? Now, one of the common questions is, what do you do when you have 2 varying different types of skin tones in the same shot? How do you expose to make sure that both of them don't look absolutely ridiculous? Now, I decided to conscript my girlfriend and my sister in order to help me out with this shot, but here's some things that you want to keep in mind. Now, one thing that I like to do is I'll expose for my lowest common denominator. And by lowest common denominator, I mean the lowest on the IRE scale in terms of skin exposure. So to make this as easy as possible, I'm actually going to expose for Cass's skin over here. So right now, this is going to be pretty much in the range that I want it to. I can adjust a couple of things. I could bring the iris down a little bit if I want a bit more exposure. However, going up one stop doesn't really change a whole lot. And also, I don't want to get to a part where Janelle's face ends up getting washed out or getting blown out into my IRE scale. So I can go to T2.8. I could have pretty decent exposure on both. And what I'm going to do is go into DaVinci Resolve, and I could bring down some of my highlights, or I can make a mask around the face that's going to be lighter in order to bring some of those details back so both look fairly exposed. Let's go into DaVinci Resolve and actually do that.
We're in DaVinci Resolve, and I want to show you how you can balance the exposure between two different skin tones in the same frame. Clearly, we have two different skin tone types over here, and as we were looking at in our false color, the IRE values are going to be a little bit different. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. I'm going to try to do this in the quickest way possible, but effectively what I might do here is I'm going to make a mask around the person's face that I got to balance to the rest of the frame, which is just going to be Janelle on the left. So what I'm going to go to here is I went to my masking tool, and I'm going to go to circle. Now, you can use a bunch of different ways to do this. You can make it linear, you can use curves. I'm going to use circle just because it's a little bit easier to do for the purpose of this video. I'm going to soften this part out just a little bit, just so that mask isn't super harsh. But effectively what's going to happen is everything that I'm going to do in this node only affects what's inside of the circle. So for example, if I want to go to my curves and I want to go to my top point and bring that down a little bit, only what's inside of the circle is changing while the rest of the frame is exactly the same. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind as well is on the right side of the screen, the very bottom over here, this circle is your vector scope. Now, there's going to be a thin line that's over here, and this is the flesh, skin tone, or bloodline. There's a bunch of different names for it. But one thing you want to keep in mind is no matter what your ethnicity is, you could be Hispanic, black, white, doesn't matter, your skin line is going to actually be right over here. So you can make even smaller masks and pinpoint things just exactly the way that you want them to. I'm going to go by eye over here, but just know that if there's a lot of information on that side, that's usually going to be skin tones. Now, another technique that's going to be, something else that's going to be new on DaVinci Resolve is going to be the color slice. Now, that's going to be right over here. And you have your red, your yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta, but you also have skin as well. And if you look at that little vector scope on this side, it matches up with the one on the right corner. Now, what you can do is you can change a variety of different things, especially if you want to get this in line or dialed in a little bit more. You can change the hue onto here, and again, this only affects what's on that magic mask. So I can go all the way green, which looks not great, and I can go all the way magenta, which don't screenshot that. I'm going to put this right into a place that makes a little bit more sense for the frame, and I can also adjust things like my saturation that's over here. I'm going to leave that a little bit down here and leave a bit more color into here. Maybe even just go down to like 0.3, nothing crazy. And I can adjust my luminance value as well. So that is ridiculous. I'm going to go back a little bit. I'm going to pull that back, and there we have it. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like before. A little bit overexposed. There's not a lot of saturation in there. And then when you bring everything back. Now, if you want to track that mask, maybe there's someone's face that's moving, you can go right over to here. This will be a tracking mask tool, and then you can click track forward and reverse. Now, both frames are going to be static right now, so once I press onto this, you'll see that as it goes through, it's going to mask these two together. But something to keep in mind as well is this might take a little bit. It might take a bit more from your GPU or your CPU, but here's what you can basically do in order to dial in some of your skin tones and then balance your exposure while in DaVinci Resolve.
That being said, these are some of the tools and techniques that you can use to expose for darker skin tones. Now, if you're someone that owns a Sony camera, you've probably heard this already, and I have made a couple of videos about this already, but a lot of these basic concepts can be used no matter which camera you're going to be using. Some of you guys might be on a Nikon, a Lumix, a Blackmagic, or a Fuji camera, and if you do pay attention to things like your IRE values, and maybe you try not exposing at 70 IRE for somebody with darker skin, and you do a little bit of research in terms of the log profile you're using, you're going to be able to get some really good exposure out of your darker skin tones a lot better than you thought you could. That being said, if you guys do want to see a video about lighting for people with darker skin tones, this is going to be kind of the part 2 of this. Leave a comment down below. That being said, the YouTube algorithm probably thinks you want to watch a video over there. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.